all the other gods are slowly and slowly and slowly sneezing. Hey everybody, welcome back to Tabletop Archives, where I, Frank, go over, my various world building techniques and various other things I do for D&D. Well, today we're going to go over different eras and timelines for your Dungeons & Dragons campaign. I know a lot of DMs, when they like to flesh out their campaigns and their homebrew, they like to make sure that they have a robust history that the players can discover and explore, and then they never do because it's the players. But that doesn't mean you still don't want that. Well, I'm here to give some advice on how you can have a robust history but not have to put in so much work so you don't feel like you lost all that effort because the players didn't do anything with it. This comes in the form of timelines and eras. The basic idea of a timeline is simple. You know how long it's been since a certain event. In our own real world, we look back to a specific point, and from that point forward is how we determine what year it is. That event being the birth of Jesus, because it was historically very potent when the sages made their, time frame, and also because it's Jesus. I mean, he's pretty cool. Then there are eras, which become a little bit easier when you go to the before Jesus era. It helps to break down large chunks of history into one common thing, the Stone Age, the Bronze Age. These things help you to understand what took place during those times without having to go into a lot of detail about it. And so that's what we're going to do today. So, if you look at the eras and timelines, you're going to notice that there are two key things that come out of that. Just gonna take some water real quick. That being, we need specific historical events that are important to the world as a whole, and we need a term to define the encapsulating era between the two events. So, for example, we know certain ages are the industrial age because factories started to become more and more prevalent. So that event, factories becoming useful to companies, created an age. So if we can just remember an event creates an age, that is an easy way to have a bunch of history without having to really flesh it out. So in D&D, the first thing you should probably think about when you're creating a timeline is how did it all get started? That's usually referred to as the creation myth. So if you we can go into it in a different video on how to create a creation myth for your own world, but for the sake of it, you just need something. So for my world, the world of Rayun, my creation myth is simply titled The Cataclysm. This is a point where the first few gods were around, then had to fight these monstrosities and other deities that caused chaos and horribleness, and thus through that became the material plane. So that is the big moment. From that point onward, we get the first era. I call it the Aeon of Ascension. The main reason I call it the Aeon of Ascension is because that's when a lot more gods started to pop up, whether it's because certain mortals started to ascend to godlyhood, thus the name, or because other gods just started to come into existence and form through various different means. I keep that one vague just because my players haven't really gotten into that yet, and I don't want them to know exactly what happens. I have had a few players ask, how do I become a god? And I dread the day when that happens. So this is the Aeon of Ascension, mortals existing with gods, new deities springing up here and there, but that also causes some dissent. That causes some people to question the gods. I mean, whenever you have a huge figures in power, people are going to question that. I mean, they always do. I mean, look at literally every creation myth ever. At some point, the creations rebel against the creators. And that brings us to our next event, what I call the War of Incantation. This is the idea that certain mortals started to look into other means of magic, specifically arcane magic, and how can this be used and wielded in such a way that the gods don't know how to with their divine magic and natural magic. So from this experimentation, some of these mortals attack the gods, and of course the gods fight back, because that's what you do. So this starts the War of Incantation, the War of Spells, just many different people going back and forth, either defending gods or attacking gods. No gods were harmed in the making of this war. So you have people defending the gods, people wanting to see the gods taken down and attacked. Meanwhile, the gods are up there trying not to intervene because they know the second they do, they'll just completely destroy everybody, and they don't want that. Well, while that's happening, a bunch of evil deities start to come up and become this third faction in the myth, saying, maybe we could take over once everything's done. And so, through various different tactics, these evil gods started to manipulate both sides only for the prime deities and their good gods to realize, oh crap, we're being manipulated. They eventually humble themselves, team up with the Arcanists who started this whole war, and make a deal. The deal is, if they both defeat the evil gods, the good gods will permanently leave the material plane. And thus, after this act, the evil gods were taken out, the good gods left, and then mortals were left to rule the material plane as needed. And honestly, that's a good place to stop right there. Just the fact that you have a creation myth in a first age already, and then the inciting incident to why things are the way they are right now. But I'm gonna keep going because, you know, I was the kid who did the extra credit even though I was getting 100 on the test already. So next we bring in the Serene Age. The age of peace and tranquility when mortals were able to bring up kingdoms and practice arcane magic to their wills and to their flimsies, right? That's a word. They started to develop very, very high tech. Think Eberron everywhere. Just the idea of like magic and technology interfused and interwoven. The idea that if you didn't already have arcane potential, you should probably look into that. This is the time when there was the least amount of clerics and druids and a lot of wizards and sorcerers going around. So, you know, this lasts for a decent amount of time, enough to where many different civilizations started to pop up, take control and do various things. Well, all good things have to eventually come to an end, or else what's the point of D&D? Up next is the event I call the Monumental Degradation. And it translates to the Big Mess Up. The basic idea is, while all these people stopped caring about the gods and their influence didn't have as much leeway, there was one group of adventurers that unintentionally unleashed a devil god amongst the material plane. This devil god ended up springing forth and took control of the entire realm. Like, everything. This caused the world to completely separate from the gods entirely. This devil god built this surrounding barrier so that no other gods can interfere. He started to change and weave the continents themselves. He started to banish magic items. He started to wipe everyone's mind and completely destroy whatever histories they had. Now, just a fun little aside, I got this idea because I was actually running a campaign during the Serene Age. Then the players, you know, unleashed a devil god amongst the world, and then they TPK'd, and they were the only ones who could have stopped it. So, yeah, he pretty much went unopposed and won. And that brings us into what I called the Reign of Velulos, the name of the devil god. You can put Asmodeus here if you want, but I like to make my own versions of each of those gods. So he starts to reign. He forces people to have to worship him and only him because he understands that worship ties to a deity's magic. So while he is forcing all the mortals to worship to him, all the other gods are slowly losing their power and going dormant. Of course, before all of this happened, while the devil god was taking over, because it wasn't like an overnight thing, it was about a year or so, many different civilizations, because they had the technology, just went to different planes and may or may not return later, because that's a cool plot hook. So for around 250 years, this devil god reigned over this land, renamed it and everything. You know, people got used to it. I mean, when devils are taking over, when they're the ones in charge, you kind of have to get used to it. You've signed a contract, you know what you're in for. But that didn't stop a group of heroes. And so a group rose up, and then they TPK'd. So then another group rose up and then also TPK'd. Eventually, though, I decided I didn't want to just keep having people come up and then fail and then have a campaign, not make it all the way through to see the devil god completely separated from the material plane. So I just wrote my own history based off of the most recent campaign I had, the characters that were involved in that. They became the heroes who ended up taking a stand against the devil god. So they fought and were able to banish him. And because of the, separation barrier he put up, he can't get back in. Over time, people started to realize, we don't have a devil god in charge anymore. What does this mean? The heroes approached and said, well, there were previous gods before. Each of these heroes were ignited and fueled by these gods. And soon began the last and current age in my campaign world, the era of restoration. This is the current era that a lot of people are living in, though it does take place about 300 or so years after the heroes fight. This allowed people to start to rethink societies and focus more on the gods and the religion. And that's the current age that they live in. There's I skipped ahead about 300 years after that heroes fight, mainly because I wanted some new cultures to show up, and I figured that's a good enough time to where like the society of devils and all of that has like faded away and new cultures have sprung up. Of course, there's always, you know, the races that live forever like elves who will always remember those things, but that's always a cool point to know that there's one character you can go to and be like, what happened here? And they'll be like, oh, let me tell you. So ultimately that's what I have. I have the Cataclysm, the Aeon of Ascension, the War of Incantation, the Serene Age, the Monumental Degradation, the Reign of the Forsaken One, and then finally the Era of Restoration. Now, each of these is unique and different, and by doing what I did, where I fleshed them out in a broad sense, what's nice is if I wanted to flesh them out more, I can do that. For example, this idea that some of the civilizations during the Serene Age actually were able to leave before the Devil God took over. What happens when they come back? What about societies during the Forsaken One who actually aligned themselves with the Devil God and then now have to face the fact that they're no longer aligned with that? This has brought so many different unique and interesting things in my mind. It also helps to define the weirder races, such as like the Vidalcan from Ravnica and the Kalishtar from Eberron. Before I wasn't really entirely sure how to justify those races, but if they are previous civilizations who, because they spend so much time in other planes outside the material world, they were humans who were transformed and came back, that's a cool concept. Ultimately, that's what you want in these different these eras and ages and events. You just want a broad detail of what they are without having to go into too much detail until you need to. So through this method of creating an event and then the age that follows that event, you're able to flesh out your history and your world so well without the need to flesh out your history and your world so well. And ultimately, laziness. Isn't that what we're here for? To be lazy. So if you enjoyed this video, please, I thank you for watching it. Please tell your friends, share the video, comment, subscribe, all those things that YouTube does, because the algorithm's just, it's a thing, man. It's a huge thing. And next week we'll get into some more world building. We'll see about maybe either working on one of the old nations or even talking about how I justify all different races in my world. It's actually a pretty cool thing that I recently decided on, and I'd love to share that. But let me know what you want to see in the comments, and as always, I gotta think of a sign-off at some point.